why should couples like Beyonce and Jay-Z not be able to go to Cuba and celebrate their 5-year anniversary, especially when their trip is authorized by the Department of Treasury for an educational exchange? Usually nothing, because anniversaries are supposed to be that time of year where you relax and it's supposed to be romantic. And I think the only time that couples like this receive backlash for such decisions is when the company they decide to visit is shadowed by a 40-plus year embargo. Which leads us to our main point. What exactly is an embargo? It's an order of the government prohibiting movement of merchant ships in or out of its ports. In our case, more specifically, it will be the Cuban embargo, which refers to the commercial, economic, and financial restriction imposed on Cuba by the U.S. in October of 1960. Okay. A little history lesson. The Spanish-American War ended in 1898. Spain signed over its rights to such territories like Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba to the U.S., and Cuba eventually gained its independence with the condition that America would be able to intervene in its affairs when needed. Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista's government with the U.S.'s passive support. Until Castro decided to tax America's products heavily, and he also nationalized a lot of the local subsidiaries of the U.S. government in Cuba, and that led the Eisenhower administration to enforce a strict embargo with the exception of the medical supplies and the food supplies. In 1962, President Kennedy issued a permanent embargo just after he ordered about 1,200 cigars for himself, and I'm not sure who else he may have ordered them for. President Kennedy was forced to enforce the embargo because Castro was supposedly trading with the Soviet Union and allowed them to set up missiles in Cuba, which I guess sparked a lot of political uproar and enforced the permanent embargo. Which brings us to today, and people are asking the question, why should we lift the embargo? That's what I'm here to try to convince you of. Actually, most people say that the embargo has failed to achieve its goals. Cuba does not pose a threat to the U.S. as we stand today. And we trade with countries like China, Vietnam, and Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez has openly spoke out against the U.S. by calling us things like imperialists. And they're a big contender for the oil industry, in which we are allowed to trade with Venezuela. People are allowed to go back and forth to Venezuela, yet Hugo Chavez doesn't support America. It harms the people of Cuba in such a way to where their quality of life is significantly less, if that's the word I'm trying to use, than ours. People have to survive in Cuba on wages such as $11 to $15 an hour. And they're cut off from their family that live here. Their family aren't allowed to send them things like money and food and medical supplies and things like that. They're cut off from communication devices such as cell phones or any type of media. They don't even have Yahoo down there. If the embargo were to be lifted, things like U.S. sanctions would be forced to be addressed. They would have to stop blaming the U.S. for the jalopies that they call cars. That's what they call them. They call them jalopies. There are some pros and cons to lifting the embargo. One pro would be economic growth. Usually, Texas A&M is an agricultural college. They do most of the reports on the farmers and things like that. If we were to lift the embargo, we would probably see it between $4.8 billion increase for our economy. As right now, they're losing $1.2 billion. And usually,
that would be for the U.S.?
Yes, all of these increases are for the U.S. Right now they're saying that we suffer $1.2 billion, and if we were to lift the embargo, we would see an increase of $4.8 billion. I'm not sure where they get the numbers from. But another thing would be the promise of oil.
The promise of...
And last but not least, my favorite would be the cultural, educational growth. I'm a big contender when it comes to being well-rounded and culturally diverse and learning different languages, and I think it would allow our younger generations to be able to expand and think for themselves, become free thinkers, and their identities. Whenever, if your communications are cut off with your family in another country, after so long you may lose touch with your identity and who you are, things like your heritage and things like that. And I think the quality of education would be improved if we were allowed to branch out and learn other things besides American history. Any questions?
So this speech is to convince us that it's a good idea to lift the embargo.